what is your lived experience? What's happened to you, or what's your understanding of what's happened? Or
I am bipolar 2. I suffer from bipolar 2 disorder, and wasn't diagnosed until quite late in life. The diagnosis only came about 10 years ago, and up until that point, I just thought I was just a particularly moody prick. But it turns out that I was unwell, and my illness, being diagnosed so late, caused a lot of problems with my life. It caused a lot of problems with work, in terms of treating people badly. It was great. Working in radio as I was, being bipolar was a benefit in the late 90s because I could churn out material, I could work for days on end, I could go nuts, and they loved it. But then would come the crashing lows, and then would come the self-medication and all of those issues that come along with that. So I was on this cycle that eventually had to crash. It eventually had to fall apart. But, I was terrible to people. I would expect people to do things that I was doing. I couldn't understand why they weren't doing it. The erratic behaviour ended up costing me my job in radio, and it's brought with it a terrible reputation that is very hard to get redemption for, in terms of how you treat people, how people perceive you, and half the time you can't even remember what you did to these people, but they remember, and that's what counts. So redemption is hard. You can't grant it to yourself. That's the thing. If you could, it'd be great, but it has to come from someone else. And that's one of the things that mental health does do, or mental health illness does do. It makes you make bad decisions. It doesn't let you think clearly about what you're doing. For me, either you were high and making bad decisions creatively, or you were depressed and just making bad decisions personally.
so, Steve, what is mental illness to you?
Well, there's so many ways of looking at it now. It's gone from being, it's not so much viewed as a chemical imbalance anymore, which is interesting. The common thinking now is that it's a series of switches, that it's called, I forget what it's called, but it's a series of switches in your mind that all trigger at different times, and they trigger in different ways. And that's what causes, mental illness of varying types. But to me, mental illness is something that, I look at it two ways. It's something I wish I didn't have, but then it's something also that has given me certain opportunities and things that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So it's a double-edged sword. I mean, at the moment, it's my illness and the way it's affected my personality is costing me very dearly personally. I'm separated from my wife. Things aren't going the way I'd like them to, because, it's very hard to live with somebody who goes into hospital on a semi-regular basis. And, last time I was in hospital was, I think, 5 weeks ago, and I had a full course of ECT then, because the depressive stage had become that bad. After ECT, you're fantastic. But then it doesn't take much to sort of trigger a bipolar episode. The last one was triggered by the fact lack of sleep is a classic example of what will trigger a bipolar episode. I had a shoulder replacement and a knee replacement, and the lack of sleep just sent me spiraling. And it's simple things like that you have to be hyper vigilant about. Having a mental illness means you have to be more aware of what's going on around you and how you're reacting with people, even though that same mental illness makes it very difficult to be able to do that.
Sure. So you don't have all your weaponry at your disposal to cope with life.
Oh, you have one cannon and it's very loose. That's the weaponry you've got. When it comes to that, that's what I reckon you've got. So, it's plus, it brings on other. I've had a history of self-medication. Being in hospital for a mental illness is not like being in hospital with a broken leg. If you've got a broken leg, man, people come in, there's flowers, there's chocolates, there's balloons. You go in there to, get your brain zapped. No one, not a soul, barely a phone call, nothing. It's people, it's the stigma still of society of mental illness. They just don't, it's inherent. It doesn't matter whether it's Sudanese people or people from different countries. What people don't understand, they are afraid of and they shy away from. And mental illness is possibly the biggest area of that in the country at the moment. And the incidences of the recent suicide rates have come out. I was talking to Jack Heath, who's the CEO of SANE. And male incidences of suicide has increased again, like it keeps going up. It's actually quite interesting, and I'm not demeaning the current wave of diagnoses, but it just seems to me now that anytime some footballer or an actor or somebody has a problem in their life, they put it down to depression and everybody just says, oh, it's depression, we'll leave them alone. When, there's probably much larger underlying sources, but depression seems to be the go-to illness of the moment. I've got depression, it's bad, leave me alone. If you're good, you can hide it. I went to see my psychiatrist what day of the week it was, one morning. Thought it was quite fine. That afternoon I tried to take my own life. I just had enough. And luckily I got away with it. But he still keeps the note because he says he's never seen a note written with such intent and such absolute desire to finish everything as he read there. He said it was amazing. And I said, yeah, that's because I'm a writer. I said, what you don't realise is that's the third draft. I nearly got an illustrator in for it. It was, but
you got a book deal out of it.
Yeah, but it's a terror. I mean, it's a harrowing thing, and it's just hard to describe. And then what's so important though, and it's the one thing that is lacking in a lot of people who suffer from mental illnesses' lives, is a close support network. Somebody who can identify when you're slipping. Somebody who can identify the signs that perhaps you're not quite right. You're not talking the same way you normally do. There's something a bit off. If you're living by yourself, that just drifts into the day-to-day life. Unless you have somebody who's close to you, not in a monitoring sense, but just being vigilant about how you behave, that's important. Now, the tough part about that is that's a very difficult way to ask somebody to live their life. You can't really expect somebody to be your keeper and your monitor and your everything. So, in a lot of cases, people with mental illness do drift off by themselves because the hard work involved with being with somebody with mental illness, a chronic mental illness, is just too hard for some people. Where I feel there's work to be done, and some of the work that I do with organisations is with the people who are marginalised with mental illness, the people who don't have, have never done a great job, have never really gotten ahead in life, have never had opportunities. They're the ones who require the attention. They're the ones who need people to help them. And the people who help them should be people like me, people who, not just social workers who have read up on something. They should be people who have lived experience, who can say, look, I know what you're doing. I've been through it. How about we try this? Like, this used to work for me. Why don't we give this a go? Why don't we try and enroll you in something like this that I know will suit the way your mind is working at the moment?